The next speaker is Daggash from Imperial College, and she will talk us about the value of negative emissions for the energy system with a case study in the UK.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Thanks.
Okay. So today I will be discussing the potential role of negative emissions technologies in decarbonizing the UK energy system. So in 2008, the UK agreed through the Climate Change Act to reduce greenhouse gas emissions economy-wide by 80% by 2050. And the Committee on Climate Change estimate that this means the power sector needs to be virtually decarbonized by 2050. However, in light of the Paris Agreement, deeper decarbonization pathways are needed, including an estimated 50 megatons of CO2 of negative emissions by 2050. So I'm looking at, in this study, me and my colleagues are looking at the role of BECCS and DAC in meeting those decarbonization targets. So for this work, I used the Electricity Systems Optimization Modeling Framework, or ESO for short. So this is a power systems planning tool looking to determine the optimal capacity expansion and the optimal hourly dispatch of electricity going out from 2015 to 2050 in 5-yearly time steps. Some of the constraints considered, typical capacity expansion constraints such as technology lifetimes and build rates. And we assume a 1% year-on-year increase in electricity demand in the UK. And the carbon budget for the power sector every 5 years is specified in line with the Committee on Climate Change estimates. And the model assumes perfect foresight, and it's a cost-minimizing model. So we're looking to minimize the total system cost, which is the total capital and operating costs invested in the system over the planning horizon. The technologies considered are listed on the slide. So to parameterize bio-CCS and direct air capture in the model, because there's no utility-scale BECCS plants available currently, to estimate the capital costs, we take the capex of a coal CCS plant, and we add on the conversion cost of changing the boilers from coal firing to biomass firing, adding fuel mills and also pellet storage tanks in line with the conversion costs that were carried out at Drax power station in the UK. We assume typical 500 megawatt power plant units. And in terms of the negative emissions achievable by BECCS, perhaps Mathilde will discuss more behind the supply chain but there's about 40 kilograms of CO2 per gigajoule of biomass. That's the supply chain emissions associated with the biomass here. For direct air capture, the archetype of DAC considered here is using sodium hydroxide as a capture, using sodium hydroxide for capture and regenerating the solution with calcium carbonate. So this was discussed extensively in the American Physical Society report of 2011, but the capture costs are about $600 per ton of CO2. The CapEx and OpEx showed here are levelized against the electricity consumption only. So direct air capture, the bulk of energy consumption is heat, but because of we're looking at it from an electricity systems model perspective, we've only considered the power consumption from the DAC units. As for the biomass, the source of biomass, so we're considering two sources. One is virgin biomass, locally sourced from the UK. So we estimate there's about 21 million tons of miscanthus pellets that can be produced in the UK. And if we require beyond that, then we resort to imports, which are more expensive, so about £200 per ton of pellets. Now to discuss some results. So this graph shows the optimal capacity expansion for the UK going from 2015 to 2050 in 3 different scenarios. On the left-hand bars, the unshaded bars, show when we have no negative emissions technologies available. The ones in the middle show when we have direct air capture available for deployment. And the ones on the right, the cross-hatch bars, show when we have bio-CCS available for deployment. So there's 3 important things to note from this slide. First, if you do not have any negative emissions technologies available, to meet a hard decarbonization constraint in 2050, you will have to do this via renewables and energy storage. So we see because of the low energy density of renewables, we see this large increase in the installed capacity of the system. So it goes up from about 100 gigawatts to 300 gigawatts in 35 years. When we have direct air capture available, we see that we do not need to build as much renewable capacity. This is because the negative emissions being provided by direct air capture act as an emissions offset for other CO2 emitting power plants, so particularly unabated gas in the system. So we see that the installed capacity reduces significantly relative to the first scenario. In this case, we're getting about 19 megatons of CO2 of negative emissions from DAC, and it's consuming about 1 gigawatt of power annually. Finally, in the bio-CCS scenario, we find that, again, you do not, having BECCS available to the system displaces offshore wind and solar, so the capacity of onshore wind remains fairly consistent in all scenarios. However, having BECCS available means you don't need to build up as much renewable capacity as you would previously. Another interesting thing to note is that while nuclear features significantly in the first two scenarios, when BECCS is made available, it displaces nuclear out of the system. And what this tells us is that having sort of a flexible carbon negative power generation proves more valuable than having a baseload low carbon generation in the system. So this slide more clearly shows how electricity demand is being met going from 2015 to 2050. So again, we can see when there's no negative emissions technologies available, 70% of demand is being met by renewables, some energy storage, and interconnection as well, and nuclear as well. But we see that because of the hard decarbonization constraint, you're having to you're not able to dispatch power from unabated gas plants and reduce dispatch from gas CCS. Just going back to this slide briefly, we see that the gray, there's still quite about 20 gigawatts of unabated gas in the system, but because of the decarbonization constraint, you're not able to dispatch any electricity from them. So you're underutilizing some of the assets that you've built into the power system. When direct air capture is made available, we see this rapid expansion of nuclear power. And then we see this rapid expansion of nuclear power as well as unabated gas and gas CCS. So more clearly, you can see the headroom being provided by negative emissions is allowing you to dispatch more electricity, or slightly more electricity from your unabated gas plants and more from your gas CCS plants. And in the final scenario, on the right-hand graph, you see that BECCS allows for that explosion of dispatch from your unabated gas plant. So the negative emissions you're getting from BECCS are allowing, I think it's a quadrupling of dispatch of power generation from your unabated gas plants. So BECCS is allowing you to operate other CO2 emitting assets in the system. In terms of costs, so I mentioned that the total system cost is the total capital and CapEx and OpEx invested in the system throughout the planning horizon. We see that in the case of in the no-nets case, where we have to rely on renewables and energy storage, that the total system cost rises to about £300 billion going to 2050. However, when either BECCS or DAC is made available, the total system cost falls by 40 to 50%. And as I mentioned, this is because of the CO2 emissions offset service that is being provided by negative emissions. It's allowing for cheaper electricity from unabated fossil plants to be dispatched in the system. The decarbonization pathway is broadly similar because the carbon budgets are specified every 5 years for the power sector. So while the cost reductions when you deploy BECCS or DAC are similar from a total system cost perspective, when we look more closely at the marginal cost of electricity, it greatly differs. Because DAC consumes quite a lot of energy, on the right-hand graph, we see that the marginal cost of electricity spikes to about £200 per megawatt hour going to 2050, so after we have direct air capture deployed in the system. This is because of the hard decarbonization constraint implemented in the model. So to get an added megawatt hour of electricity from, say, unabated gas, you'd have to then operate your DAC plant to compensate for the emissions from that plant. In the case of when BECCS is made available, we see that there is still an increase in the marginal cost of electricity, but it increases towards the cost, the OPEX of your BECCS plant, so to about £100 per megawatt hour of electricity. So while they may be similar in total system cost comparison, when we're looking at the marginal cost of electricity, they greatly differ, and that's significant. We use the system value metric to evaluate the value of different technologies within the power sector. So the system value is the expected reduction in total system cost per kilowatt of deployment of a given technology. And we compare that for BECCS and direct air capture. And we can see that on initial deployment of a unit of BECCS or a unit of DAC, the BECCS provides 3 times the total system cost reduction that direct air capture does. And if we keep making this capacity available till there's no marginal decrease in your total system cost, what we've called here the economic level of deployment, we see that the system value of both technologies sort of reaches similar values. However, on initial deployment, BECCS has far more value than direct air capture in the system. Now to look more closely at how decarbonization is being achieved with these 2 technologies. So the graph on the left shows the sources and sinks of emissions in the power sector. On the left for when BECCS is made available, and on the right when direct air capture is made available. And we see that as we have more negative emissions being deployed in the system, this is almost providing a direct offset for only unabated gas. So there is a value transfer taking place between the negative emissions being provided by BECCS and unabated gas. In the direct air capture scenario, it's slightly less, the increase in the emissions from unabated gas. So on the right, we try and determine the value transfer that's taking place between negative emissions technologies, either BECCS or DAC, and the unabated gas plants. And we see more clearly this as you deploy more BECCS in your system or DAC in your system, that the revenue of unabated gas plants increases. So there's a direct value transfer. Unabated gas is directly benefiting from having CO2 emissions offsets in your system. And monetizing this CO2 emissions offsets is potentially a way to reduce the public burden of delivering these negative emissions. So I think it's been discussed that BECCS can provide different services in the energy system. In the case of the power sector, you can either provide an electricity service or CO2 removal service. So more closely, we want to determine what principal service BECCS is providing at any given point in the system. So to do this, we look at the utilization factors of the power plants. So the dashed lines are for the unabated gas, and the solid lines are for BECCS. And we see that in 2030, when BECCS is deployed initially, that it's essentially load following. So the power plants are operating to provide a direct CO2 emissions offsets to unabated gas. But going to 2050, so the solid red line, we see that BECCS begins to operate at its maximum power output, so it can provide as much CO2 removal as possible to meet that decarbonization target. So the emission target really dictates the principal service that BECCS is providing at any given point. I mentioned that the UK, in light of the Paris Agreement, would need deeper decarbonization pathways relative to those specified in the Climate Change Act. So we imposed the 50 megatons of CO2 of negative emissions, that target, on the power sector. So we assume that that emissions offset is being provided from the power sector. So how does that change the optimal generation mix? And we see the generation mix is broadly similar to the BECCS scenario I showed earlier, only that as we need more negative emissions, we need to deploy more BECCS capacity. And I think in this case, we have about 14 gigawatts of BECCS power plants being built, and we have reduced, and this directly displaces gas from the system. So we have more generation from BECCS and less from gas. And this results in a 10% rise in total system cost. One more thing to mention is that to meet those targets, the UK's supply of biomass is not sufficient. So I think about 2 million tons of pellets in this case are being imported at £200 per ton, so almost double the cost of locally sourced biomass. And lastly, so we look at how BECCS and direct air capture compete to meet a negative emissions target in a system at different costs. So if you attended some of the direct air capture talks earlier in the week, they cited costs that were lower than previously thought in the American Physical Society report. But what this showed on the left-hand graph is that even with significant cost reduction in the capital cost of direct air capture, BECCS is still preferentially deployed in the system because of this added service of electricity generation that it can provide. So unless the costs of BECCS have been significantly underestimated, or direct air capture can be significantly cheaper than the estimates today, then BECCS is always more competitive to meet that negative emissions target. On the right, we look at the sensitivity to biomass prices as well. And again, we see that only at very high biomass costs and high BECCS CapEx cost do we see direct air capture beginning to have a role to play in meeting the negative emissions target for the UK. So now, just to conclude, I've shown that nets could potentially reduce the cost of decarbonisation by allowing for the operation of cheaper thermal assets in the power sector. BECCS adds more value to the electricity system because it can not only provide the CO2 removal service, but also the electricity generation service, and also monetizing the CO2 emissions offsets from negative emissions technologies could potentially reduce the public burden of delivering negative emissions. Because as we've seen, negative emissions are providing a direct value transfer to unabated power plants in the system. Thank you.